Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins in a very deep forest. Many dogs were chasing a girl who was running away from them. These animals were incredibly angry. They began to attack her in a large pack. However, she managed to fight off these creatures. One by one, she put them down forever. And in the end, she was left with only one dog as an opponent, who became even more angry because his brothers had died. Soon he was about to attack the girl. However, she easily killed him too. After that, she opened the special task menu and, breathing a sigh of relief, thought that the village of newcomers had these creatures, of course, very weak. Then the girl suddenly noticed that she still had a little time before their boss showed up, so she decided to stay the night and come back later. Then she touched her ring, which was on her finger, and quickly took it off. Immediately after the girl did this, she found herself in a completely different world and appearance. The girl was in her room on a small sofa, which was incredibly luxurious. And immediately, as soon as she was transported back to her room, she felt a very pleasant aroma. She recognized it immediately because it was hot cookies. Some time passed from that moment, and soon the maid brewed fresh tea for the girl and brought baked cookies. The girl immediately took a bite and began to really enjoy the wonderful taste of this chocolate cookie. She thought about how Agnes made the most amazing cookies that could last forever. She even assumed that they were softer than usual that day. But at that moment, the maid came to see Mistress Alice. She asked her forgiveness for the intrusion but was very agitated. Alice looked at her in surprise and immediately asked, "What happened?" The maid, coming closer to her, asked if she had heard that His Majesty would visit their gardens that day. The girl, of course, did not attach as much importance to this as Agnes, so she replied that she already thought that something serious had happened from her reaction. Some time later, the lady asked, "Has His Majesty really called all his concubines?" The maid immediately said that this was not so at all. The minister had asked His Majesty to visit all the chambers, and that was why he would come to them too. Alice immediately asked, "Does this mean that he dates each of them in turn?" To which the maid replied that she did not know all the details of the process. However, Agnes also said that the rest dressed up to the highest standard in order to attract His Majesty's attention. Alice, continuing to drink her tea, said that she had already said that there was no need to disturb her like this unnecessarily. However, the maid objected and said that His Majesty would be visiting them for the first time in 2 years. The lady was silent for a while, and then asked how many concubines he had in total. Agnes had to think for a while, but soon she said that, as far as she knew, there were 48 ladies. Alice put the cup back, stood up and asked the maid how many of these girls were just using him. The maid didn't have to think long. She immediately said that it was Mrs. Feroz and Mrs. Heartbarrel. Alice immediately said that it was very good, and then, smiling, she asked how many concubines, in her opinion, there were who would be more beautiful than she. The maid, of course, felt uneasy about this question and did not know how to answer it. And the mistress, in turn, asked the girl to be honest because she would not be offended. Then Agnes said that it was probably 10 people. As promised, Alice took it completely calmly. So she asked, does she really think that the emperor, who is not even interested in women, would choose her over 10 more beautiful female concubines? But Agnes still insisted on her own, and said that Mrs. Alice already looked beautiful enough, and if she dressed up, she would become completely unimaginable. Of course, Alice was pleased to hear such compliments, but she did not believe in them, so she asked the maid to calm down, because she was destined to live in this place alone for the rest of her days. Agnes really didn't like the way the lady was talking about herself, so she wanted to protest by shouting her name loudly, but the girl shouted back at her, telling her not to raise her voice at her. They were silent for a while, and then Alice, sighing heavily, said that she had been telling her the same information for the 4th year in a row, so she should give up completely. Agnes sighed heavily, saying that she had received letters from the Empress many times. The girl suddenly smiled and asked with a sarcastic expression, "Since when did Charnel become her sister and not hers?" The maid, in her defense, replied that years had already passed, and she was still asking whether she would ever see her heir. The girl, hearing about this, immediately turned white and asked, "Is she really still thinking about these heirs?" Agnes said that of course it was, and added that the lady was very worried about it. Then Alice ran up to her and immediately asked, "From whom should this heir be?" The maid was very surprised by her stormy behavior, and in a calm, detached voice replied that, of course, this child must be from His Majesty the Emperor. Alice was all beaming with joy and asked, "Does it really have to be from Bahamut, the fourth emperor of the real Western Empire, Alfred and her?" Agnes, smiling, said that of course that was the right answer and added, "That's exactly what she's talking about, so they need to prepare for his arrival." But then the girl suddenly turned around and said that she couldn't do that, and also asked her for forgiveness for it. Agnes was very surprised by such behavior, but after that she told her mistress that she was already the emperor's concubine, and everything would work out if she was a little more assertive. After that, she said that the girl had come to this place at the age of 18 and was now supposed to conceive an heir, whose face she had never even seen. She said that perhaps there would be no problems with giving birth. However, before that, she had to do the very thing she was thinking about. Agnes was all excited and also said that she must take advantage of the opportunity to attract His Majesty's attention. Alice, of course, was not interested in all this and asked what kind of opportunity they were talking about. But the maid said that she absolutely had to find this very opportunity for everything to work out. Alice came up to the bed at this point and said that even if she did her best, it didn't mean she would ultimately succeed. She loved to call the maid her sister, so, addressing her as such, the girl said that she should first of all worry about her well-being. The maid looked at her in surprise and asked, "Does she really think there might be some danger waiting for her?" And Alice asked in surprise, "Does she really not know about this?" And when the girl saw her surprised expression, she immediately said that one of the concubines who tried to get closer to the emperor was beaten with a whip by Fayrouz. But after that, waving her hand, she said that since there was no reaction from His Majesty after the incident, she believed that he did not care at all. Alice also said that the emperor's mistresses were absolutely delighted with what was happening, and she believed that it was very dangerous outside, so everything would be fine if she just kept her head down. At that moment, Alice lay down on the bed and was very happy, and the maid was indignant in a stern voice and said that she could not believe that the girl had decided to live like this for the rest of her life. But the girl replied that she should not make too much noise because she was just a tribute, a hostage who ensures that Entrall will not touch Alfred's empire. Agnes was very outraged by these words. She already wanted to object, but the girl turned over on her other side and said that she didn't want to know anything. Alice said that even if there was no empress or queen, then of course it was impossible to marry a concubine who was being held hostage. So it had nothing to do with her at all. The maid, who was very interested in the whole matter, immediately exposed the girl and said that any concubine could become an empress. At first, Alice was very surprised, but after that, covering herself with a blanket, she laughed nervously and said that, of course, such a thing was impossible, so she was not going to continue this dialogue. Agnes took the blanket from her again and said that Mistress Alice had every chance of it, so she should not write herself off under any circumstances. The girl, indignantly telling her to stop saying this, said, "But my ears are withering." But the maid insisted on her own and said that she would succeed. Then, kind Alice, who always knew how to control her emotions, could not stand it, and began to shout at the maid, saying that she was in no way going to spend the night with the emperor. The girl also said that she would never give her body to a man she doesn't even love. Because of all these conversations, Agnes even blushed, because she did not like such open words and, indignantly, said that the lady was too straightforward. Alice decided to continue her rebellion, and getting out of bed, she said that she still wanted to have a lover. The maid, hearing about this, was again very surprised and said that if anyone found out, she would definitely be executed. Alice, indignant, said that she had not come to her all this time, but now she also wanted to deprive her of her freedom. The maid wanted to object, but then suddenly thought about it and asked, "Does she really mean that virtual reality of Davis?" The lady turned to her and said that no matter how much the emperor loved her, having a lover was punishable by death, and also asked, "Can she leave and not bother her anymore because she does not like this kind of conversation at all?" The maid, in tears, began to run out of the room and told Mistress Alice that it was just a nightmare and that she would tell everything about this empress. However, Alice was not at all surprised by this, because she shouted that the girl always tells her everything, so it doesn't matter at all what happened between them. After that, Agnes left, and the girl wondered if she had gone a little too far, because sometimes she could get too carried away and even forget that people could have tender feelings. Of course, she didn't want to make the maid cry, but even if she did, she would soon return as if nothing had happened. Alice thought that this was just normal whining, so she decided not to respond to it, and was very glad that she was finally alone again. In her stretched-out pajamas with huge bags under her eyes, she needed to cheer Agnes up when she saw her again, because after all, it was her fault. However, this was exactly what her freedom was. Although at first glance Alice looked like a potato, if you looked closely, you could see an elegant cat. She walked over to the couch, lay down on it, and thought about how Schnarl had once looked at her and said that her style wasn't good enough. However, she liked herself, so she didn't take that criticism seriously at all. Moreover, Alice got married 14 years ago, and it had been 7 years since her last meeting with the emperor, and the girl had to spend the rest of her life in the place where they gave it to her. But in fact, Alice was happy with all of this, because she had the opportunity to get into another virtual world with the help of a special ring, which she put on at that moment. As soon as the girl moved there, a sign immediately appeared before her eyes, welcoming her to the virtual world. The girl was wearing a military uniform, which allowed her to move around very easily. Then she touched the ground and thought that, despite the fact that this was a virtual world, everything in it was very real. So as long as that place existed, she could have another life for herself, which she enjoyed. Soon the girl climbed down from the mountain on which she appeared, and found herself again in the middle of the forest. In fact, this free world in which she found herself was completely different from reality. In fact, those who first came there were probably scared by the deserted atmosphere. However, instead of a suffocating cage, Alice felt a fresh breeze of Mother Nature in that place. And instead of tight dresses and nightgowns, she had a comfortable and free assassin's uniform. Of course, the girl was not one of them, but she liked these clothes incredibly, so she wore them with pleasure. Alice opened the task menu and basically the map of this world. Then she saw that there was almost no activity in it, which meant that the boss creatures had not appeared yet. She was very angry, because she did not catch before he finally appeared and she could fight him. Alice was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't even immediately notice how many monsters appeared behind her. For any other person, they would have seemed incredibly scary and invincible. But the girl, having just closed the task menu, immediately went on the attack, not understanding why there are only such small fish in this world. Of course, she wanted to make her job harder so that she could defeat them with great difficulty. However, she had to at least defeat these ones without even making any special efforts in order to move on. Soon after, Alice finally killed all those monsters that were going to attack and maim her. In the process of all this, she received additional points. The girl also saw a notification that the numbers that appeared reflected the experience gained. By killing these creatures, she received it. Soon after it was over, she looked around and realized that, judging by their number, it was a mid-level creature boss. But she was almost uninterested in things like level or health. Because she was too angry, she didn't even notice how she swung at the tree and accidentally cut it down. It was only when Alice lost 100 points that she noticed it, and felt a little upset that she had miscalculated her strength and emotions. In fact, if she were to harm that nature, her indicators would decrease, and with her level, she wasn't particularly worried about such things. She just hated negative numbers with all her soul, so she tried not to do such things. Alice opened the task menu again and thought that she should have guessed that the catch would be weak, since she was near the village of newbies. Then she suddenly realized that now was the time for the main boss to appear. She also decided to check how many wool balls she had left from the Lord of the Deep Forest. When she went into her inventory, she saw that there were only 5 of them. But this made her happy, because she had 5 more to destroy, and everything would be fine. In fact, the Lord of the Deep Forest is a boss monster that appears once a day and immediately disappears. Therefore, if time runs out or another player intercepts it, the Overlord will not appear until the next day. However, Alice really had nothing to worry about. And all because the news that she was in that place should have already spread among high-level players. And since the boss is not easy to catch, newbies certainly won't interfere with her. And yet she did not understand why nothing was happening, because by the time she had already arrived, he should have appeared long ago. But then Alice suddenly thought that perhaps he had simply appeared in another place. So she summoned the ferryman to her with a special spell. And soon after that, a huge beast appeared near her which had leashes. She immediately went to him and began to calm him down, because this creature was a little scared. She began to hug him and told Big Pippi that he should not worry. In fact, this bird's name was Pippi, and he was her carrier and also always made different sounds, so she named him that. This carrier is a kind of way of transportation in the world she was in. However, it may not be available to all players. While Alice was playing, she realized one thing. In this world, carriers differ depending on the region of the real world. She's never been to the east and north, so she doesn't know about the local transport. In the west of the real world, where the Alpha Empire is located, they prefer to travel on 4-legged animals, such as horses, camels, or wolves. But in the south, they move on huge birds. Depending on the strength of their wings and legs, they are divided into several types. Such birds can be for flight, as well as a related type, and for land movement, of course, they also exist. Alice certainly liked them very much because of their soft plumage. They were also graceful and intelligent, and that is why she chose the latter type of bird. Alice mounted her beautiful animal and asked Pippi if he could find the Lord of the Deep Forest for her. This animal, without thinking twice, immediately ran at an incredibly high speed. After all, it understood the girl's request and immediately wanted to fulfill it. While Alice was driving, she decided to use another item for herself. It was an elegant cloak. Also in the process, she activated something like a mirror to see what she looked like. And soon she saw her reflection. There the girl immediately smiled and thought that, as she thought, she really looked very cool. Alice thought that with such appearance and physique, she would not yield even to the Empress. But then suddenly, Pippi stopped and began to scream very loudly. The girl realized that something was wrong, so she immediately looked to the side, and then right in front of her she saw a huge forest monster. Of course, she recognized that it was the Lord of the Deep Forest and was glad that he was there after all. Soon she removed the Pippi with one movement so that he would not get hurt. However, the girl was alarmed by another fact, that usually this Lord of the Forest attacks first. However, this time he did not do so. And the moment Alice looked away, she suddenly saw that this monster was distracted by another player. She was too far away from them, so she couldn't see everything clearly. When she got closer, of course, she couldn't see his name on top, because you can find it out if you fight this person, or he will introduce himself. Well, even though she didn't know this person, she realized that he was a newbie. A complete newbie who had just entered virtual reality. Alice was so sure of this, only because it was the newbies who could rush at the Lord of the Deep Forest without regard for the difference in levels. So she believed that he would die once again. However, she also thought that he was a little luckier because the village was nearby, so it would take him about an hour to get back. Alice stood and watched for a while, but then she realized that the pain would be the same as in the real world. Very realistic. And besides, if you die in the virtual world, then in life you can sleep for several days in a row. So the girl decided to save his time and life. She was going to destroy this monster before it could kill the newbie, so she immediately began to attack this terrible creature from behind. The monster quickly sensed that something was wrong, and so turned towards the girl who was flying straight at him. Without thinking twice, Alice finally destroyed this monster and thought that, of course, it was not theft of someone else's creature at all. So she hoped that nothing would happen for this. But when the fight ended and the monster died, she gained a few points for killing him, but also lost a pretty large number. She was very surprised when she saw this, and because of this, the girl even began to panic. Soon she received a notification that she had received the wool of the Lord of the Deep Forest, as well as a few more additional functions. But Alice was just worried about why she had lost points. It certainly didn't look like a mistake, so she assumed she had damaged the local flora again. But she didn't dwell on it for long, thinking that it was time for her to return, because a lot of time had passed. And just as Alice was about to take off the ring, she received a new notification that she had also received new adventurer's trousers. When she saw this, she immediately decided to look back and saw that the newcomer was no longer there. This made her very worried. But soon the girl realized that, apparently, he was simply touched and died along with the monster. She was very upset that now she had to check the records to see if this was really the case. Then the girl immediately opened these records, and it was written there that she really killed the player. The place and time, as well as the deceased and the player who killed, everything was recorded. And as soon as Alice saw that on the 14th day of the wind she killed Bahamut, she was very surprised. In fact, in virtual reality, the names that are used there are real ones in the world. First name, last name, or patronymic. One of these is chosen by the system. So the girl laughed loudly and thought that if it really was the emperor, then execution would be inevitable. She was not very worried because she thought that there were many people with such a name. She also saw no reason to worry because she believed that the emperor himself was in the garden. However, she even felt better, and the girl assumed that this was most likely due to the fact that they had such similar names. No matter how powerful this name was in real life, in the virtual world it belonged to a high-level player, and all the information about him was in special records. So she thought that this guy would definitely come back for his pants. Alice sat down on the ground, thinking that it would probably take him about an hour to revive. She also thought that if he was a high-level player, he wouldn't need these pants. But with a newbie, it was a completely different matter. The girl was positively beaming with joy because in virtual reality the players' faces were exactly the same as in real life, which meant that she would be able to see the real person. Then, in order not to waste time, Alice called to her a gray wolf cub who was very small and incredibly cute. Alice turned to him and, stroking him, said that he should grow up as soon as possible. In fact, he was still a baby, but with training he would become an excellent assistant, worthy of a carrier. Wolves can actually take part in combat, which makes them even more versatile and increases their value. So Alice activated training mode to teach the doggy this. Quite quickly she taught him to sit, give a paw, and even stand. The wolf did everything diligently, and she praised him, saying that he was a great fellow. Soon after she found a stick nearby and decided to teach him another command. Of course, she wasn't very good at training, but she had to try. Throwing the stick aside, she said the command, "Fetch." The wolf immediately ran after her and took it in his mouth. However, he quickly got tired of this and turned his attention to a frog that was running past. Alice was very angry. She immediately ran after him, asking where he was going and also telling him to come back as soon as possible. But the wolf did not listen to her and continued chasing the frog. At that moment, a guy appeared in front of the girl. He immediately addressed her with a rough voice. Alice did not expect to hear him, so she even froze in place from surprise. Slowly turning her head, the girl looked back and saw a blond guy with a very rude expression on his face. He smiled and asked if it was her, and the girl was glad that he had finally come. Of course, Alice suspected that the newbie she had thrown into the dead players would come for her, but she didn't expect the following two things at all. Firstly, the girl did not expect to hear such an attractive voice because it was really very good. And the second thing was that he would speak to her so familiarly at their first meeting. Alice didn't know what to do with him, since he was so unceremonious from the very beginning. She even thought about just throwing those pants at him and just leaving. But still, his voice somehow lured her to it, so she didn't want to just turn away from him. She decided to just look at him and leave, so she turned slowly and said that it was indeed her. After that, Alice asked, "Is he really Bahamut?" She decided that she would not reproach herself for such an ignorant attitude, because he was the first to decide to conduct a dialogue without any ceremony. The guy immediately smirked and said that it was exactly like that, and Alice kept thinking that he shouldn't complain about the way she treated him, since he started it. But here's what was most important. When Alice saw him, she couldn't take her eyes off him, especially his height. The girl thought that he was probably about 6 feet tall, and he was such a handsome guy. She was very curious about who he was in real life, and she even suggested that he was some kind of alien. Of course, she didn't know where he was from, but for some reason she was very excited, and the girl's face turned red. And Alice also thought that she wanted to have a lover, which meant that she had a new candidate for this role. She noticed that he was wearing a new adventurer outfit and also had a sword with him. But when the girl lowered her gaze a little lower, she noticed that he was standing there without any pants, only in his underwear. Of course, Alice knew that this lingerie was intended for beginners looking for adventure. And since he is a newbie, his basic abilities are expectedly low. And the longer she looked at him, the happier she became. Alice, wiping away her tears of laughter, suddenly saw his rude expression. The guy, turning to her, said that he was simply amazed. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he was saying this. And Bahamut replied that she had killed a man. And instead of apologizing, she was cynically examining and assessing the situation. The man was categorically dissatisfied with her behavior, and seeing his anger, Alice immediately asked for forgiveness and said that in fact, the killing of players happens in this world quite often, and all this is because of trifles. And besides, she asked how she could have fun if she worried about such trifles. Bahamut was simply furious at her behavior. However, he could not answer her, because he was in no position to argue with a girl who had his pants. Alice stood a short distance away from him and smiled. She thought there was something cute about him after all, so she suggested that maybe she should really have a virtual love. Of course, it's possible that in the real world she said those words just to irritate Agnes because of her rude tone. However, now that she had met someone who wasn't so bad of a partner, she felt like she really wanted it. But the girl had one problem. She didn't know how to have a love relationship in the virtual world. She suggested that she could offer to help him level up since he was a newbie. Alice had heard of many couples developing relationships in this way. Of course, they also broke up afterwards due to the gap between the real and the virtual, but she liked the idea anyway. The virtual reality is such that there is a guy who appeared out of nowhere, Bahamut. And if it's not a girl, then with his appearance, someone else will hit on this man. At that moment, the guy looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she was looking at him so intently and not answering. However, at that moment, Alice smiled happily and thought that she had decided everything. She was going to steal his heart because she was in the virtual world, which meant that there were high-level players there. That was the law and justice. So the girl was going to take him away from the newbie camp so that no other high-level players would see him. But then she suddenly realized that if she just told him everything directly, it would look weird. So the girl had to figure out how to act so as not to scare him off. Alice had actually been in a corner of the Imperial Palace for a very long time, and that was the reason she had forgotten how to interact with people at all. She tried to remember how she had behaved in society before she moved into the palace, and at that moment a memory came to her of how at one of the events, like a ball, many men were circling around her. All these men paid Alice a lot of compliments, and she, smiling coquettishly, thanked them. Every time at the ball, she talked to so many young men, they all smiled at her and did so many nice things, and she behaved so naturally. So Alice decided that she just needed to remember how it was before, so that everything would be fine now. And the first step in her plan was Operation Smile. Thinking about it, She immediately smiled happily, looking straight at this guy. She really hoped that she was just as excellent in appearance and would not lose to his awesomeness. So for a while, she just stood silently and smiled, looking at the guy. After this, Alice decided to activate stage number 2, namely, praising her appearance. So, without thinking twice, she turned to Bahamut and said that he was an incredible, handsome man. The man didn't take this compliment very positively, so he only grimaced even more and didn't understand why she was behaving like that. When Alice saw that expression on his face, she was even a little upset, because that was not the reaction she expected to see at all. The girl decided that maybe she just hadn't complimented him well enough. So, continuing to smile, she said that he even had a sexy body. After that, she began to ask him many questions. Whether it was correct how she remembered his name, and also whether he was from the virtual world or from Earth. But the guy didn't answer. He just silently extended his hand forward and looked the girl straight in the eyes. Alice, when she saw this, was very surprised and thought that he probably wanted something, and also remembered that he was standing without pants, and assumed that most likely with such a movement he was hinting that he wanted to return them. So, without thinking twice, she asked if he would answer her question first. But in the meantime, Alice activated the adventurer's pants. And in addition to suffering on any front, she continued all this for an entire hour, not just to return this thing to him. The man continued to get angry, and in a rude voice told her to give him his pants back. At that moment, Alice noticed that he had not understood her words at all. So, after showing him the pants, she said that when he answered, she would return them. And then she asked if he was from the virtual world or from somewhere on Earth. At that moment, the guy sighed very heavily and said that he was already ready to accept the fact that she killed him and forget about this incident. But at that moment, Bahamut grabbed his sword and said that she apparently did not understand the seriousness of the whole situation, so he had to teach her a lesson. The girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he was acting so smug. But then she suddenly smiled and thought that he was very impatient. So Alice turned to him and asked, "Is he really going to defeat her with a sword?" Bahamut suddenly laughed and asked if she really thought he could lose to a woman. Alice didn't react to this at all, because she disliked this kind of sexism more than anything. She still didn't understand why he was being so stubborn when he could have just calmly answered her questions. And she really hoped that she had simply misheard him when he said that he wouldn't lose to a woman because he was such a man. And besides, she thought that judging by the way he was acting, he certainly had a lot of modesty. The girl eventually came to the conclusion that this guy didn't differentiate between the virtual and real worlds. Of course, the abilities of the real world are also applied in the virtual one, but this directly relates to experience and not to combat abilities. If the virtual level is not very high, then the case will correspond. In other words, physical abilities in the virtual and real worlds are two different things. Alice smiled and thought that the guy still hadn't figured it out. So she turned to him and said that, of course, everything in this world is virtual, but perhaps it would be better for him to read the manual before entering. But Bahamut would not listen to her words. He suddenly shouted furiously at her, asking her to be silent, and then pointed his sword at her. When Alice saw this, she thought that he had the best stance of all she had seen in this region, so she assumed that he was actually a knight and had memorized all such maneuvers. However, when he began to approach closer, the girl found herself simply confused. She can handle a novice adventurer's sword even with her bare hands, and so when Bahamut acts like such a serious person, she's very tempted to just tease him out of spite. As Bahamut continued to approach her with his, he asked something with a mocking tone. Does she really think she can handle him with her bare hands? But he also said that he understood everything, and added that it would look dubious if he, with a sword, were to be an opponent of an unarmed woman. Alice suddenly laughed to herself and thought that he must be following the rules of etiquette when confronting a woman. So the man put his sword back in its sheath and said that he also did not need to use the weapon in such a case. When Alice saw this, she was very surprised. She could not believe that the guy was really so serious about fighting with her. But she decided not to give him any more advice, since he didn't listen to it anyway. And so she beckoned him with her finger, saying that since he was so confident in his abilities, he could attack. Bahamut, once again standing in a stance, began to approach her, saying that she was indeed a very suspicious woman. But at that moment, Alice suddenly lifted his pants up and said that she had caught the bear with her bare hands, so she certainly shouldn't have any problems with him. The man didn't think long. He ran at her to attack, and having made the first blow, missed because Alice very quickly dodged him. The girl, smiling, said that he could even use a sword, but he still wouldn't be able to win against her. Bahamut was already starting to get really angry about this, and he also couldn't stand it when people took such fights so frivolously. But Alice only smiled. She touched him with one finger as the boy was about to strike again, and then something unusual happened. The newbie's life quickly began to be taken away from him by this one blow, and soon he fell dead, and a sign appeared above him stating that he had died. Alice immediately laughed awkwardly and thought that she had gone a little overboard with her efforts, because she had absolutely no intention of killing him. But after that, she sat over his corpse and said in a gentle voice that she still wasn't going to return the pants because she had killed him. The guy, of course, heard what was going on the whole time and was very angry, but Alice said that if he respawned leaving the pants there, they would just disappear, so she decided to keep them for now. Also, before leaving, she said that her name was on the player kill system list, and by clicking on it, he would be able to contact her. So she asked him to call her as soon as he respawned. But smiling, she said that if, of course, he didn't need the pants, then he didn't have to do it. She wouldn't mind keeping them for herself as a trophy. After that, the girl with the smooth voice said that she really hoped that he was not too hurt by the fact that a girl killed him, and that this would not affect his desire to see her again. Soon his business began to take shape, and Alice said she was a little sad at the thought of not seeing him again, so she forgave him so that he would not give it up. She also remembered that she had to give him some advice, so she told him that when he met someone for the first time, he should address them politely. And anyway, if he had asked politely in the first place, she would have returned those pants to him without hesitation, of course. His body slowly began to disappear, and Elia said that politeness was very important, so she would return his pants to him when they saw each other again, and she really hoped that the lesson would be learned. Soon, when his body finally disappeared, the girl lost 300 points, and a new item was added, the newbie pants. Alice couldn't help laughing, and immediately began to laugh loudly. She really hoped she hadn't overdone it when she did that. Of course, she was only going to return the trousers and leave, but she couldn't resist. Being treated so impolitely was too much in her opinion. She waited for him for an hour to return the trousers, did not do any of her own business, and he treated her like this. But still, when Alice calmed her anger, she realized that she felt a little sorry for him. He died from her attack, was resurrected, and was killed again. So she was very curious whether he would come to her again. She even thought that because of her actions, the man could simply abandon the virtual reality. And although she complimented him, she did not understand where she got this feeling as if she had done something bad. Perhaps because she had never been in a relationship before, she felt like she was doing a lot of things wrong. And Alice really hoped that he didn't think she was some kind of pervert who had just met a man for the first time. She decided that she needed to learn as much as possible about how to make a man fall in love with her, in order to not make similar mistakes again, if they were present, of course. After thinking for a while, the girl decided to call on a geographical assistant, and soon a creature appeared right in front of her, looking like a little boy with red wings and incredibly beautiful eyes. This little angel was very small in size, so he immediately turned to the lady and asked what she wanted to know. When Alice saw him, she immediately couldn't help but call him very cute, and also said that she incredibly wanted to cuddle him. The boy, of course, didn't like all this, because when she touched him, her finger simply passed through his body. So in a rough and upset voice, he asked her to ask only what he could answer. Alice finally calmed down and then asked where the great library of their virtual world was. This assistant also became a little kinder and said that the library was in the western part of the city where she was staying. The girl also asked how long it would take to get there. He replied that it would take her about 3 months on foot and that there was a carriage moving nearby, so if she used it, she could shorten the time. Alice looked at him in surprise and said that it was too far for her, and also asked if there were libraries associated with the Alfra Empire. The assistant replied that there was an Imperial Public Library, Alfri, and a General Library, Alfred. Then she asked how long it would take to get there. The little angel replied that it would take about 3 days on foot, and also said that there was a cart moving nearby, and if she used it, she would get there in about 4 hours. But as soon as Alice heard all the information she needed, she called away the graphic assistant with one movement, without even saying goodbye to him. After that, she looked at her hand, where the ring with which she was in virtual reality was located, and thought that they usually use a virtual library. However, this time it was very far away. She supposed that perhaps in the real world it would be much faster if she went to the Imperial Library of Argur. She was angry that she had to put in so much effort to have fun and love virtual reality. But then she thought about how he wouldn't be hanging around without pants all the time, so he would definitely want to find her. Alice immediately took off the ring, thinking that it would quickly return. After that, she received a notification from the system that she was disconnecting from the virtual world. And at that very moment, the girl took on her usual appearance and found herself in the same room where she was. She just sat for a while, trying to get her bearings after she had moved. But when everything returned to normal, she decided that she had to get ready to go out, so she immediately called Agnes to her. When the maid came to her, she immediately asked for forgiveness. She looked very sad, but Alice did not pay attention to this and said that she was going outside, so she asked her to bring her a dress. When Agnes heard this, she simply beamed with joy, and running up to her mistress, took her hands, saying that she had finally been able to make her feelings reach the girl. But Alice looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she was talking about. Then the girl said that all the ladies were going to the garden and they would still have time to join them. Agnes had already started to leave in order to prepare everything for the girl, but Alice already wanted to object, but she couldn't even say anything. The maid was incredibly happy and said that in fact she had already prepared everything in advance, so she would immediately bring the girl her outfit. Alice immediately screamed loudly and asked Agnes to spare her, but the maid ignored such words and told the mistress to be patient a little, because everything must be perfect. And when the girl was brought the dress, the maid began to tighten it tightly, saying that it needed to be done as tightly as possible so that everything would look beautiful. Alice suddenly started yelling at her, saying that at this rate she would simply break her ribs. But Agnes, smiling, asked the girl not to exaggerate so much because she knew that in reality it was not as painful as she said. Some time had passed since then, and Alice was already dressed in the dress that the maid had prepared for her, and Agnes, moving a little further away, looked at her, saying that, as expected, this color suited her incredibly. Alice at this moment looked at her reflection in the mirror in surprise and felt very uncomfortable. She began to cover her chest with her hands because it was literally on display. Then the girl turned to the maid and said that this was too much, but Agnes began to dissuade her and said that men liked this kind of thing, so everyone would be in similar outfits and she should not stand out. But Alice objected and said that she didn't like it at all, and she didn't understand why so many decorations were needed at all, because they simply distracted from the general picture. The girl started to fix her hair at the back and said that the magical objects from virtual reality are useless in the real world, so there are some tricks here. Alice did not object and said that even if it was so, she would protect herself with her own strength. Now she could too. But Agnes continued to object and said that even if so, it was still virtual, and it would be much more important to gain the favor of His Majesty, or at least a knight of the Imperial Guard. Some time later, the maid began to tidy up her hair and asked why not try out a virtual reality masterpiece, because then they would be able to embody everything in the world. Alice sighed heavily and said that in order to get it, one had to be a player with a name, but even that wouldn't guarantee that the person would get it. Agnes was very surprised when she heard this and said that the girl was already a veteran of virtual reality and asked if she still couldn't be called a person with a high name. Alice was very angry at this behavior because she really dreamed of this thing and said that this title cannot be just taken and received. The maid realized that it was better not to argue, so she said that she knew better and suggested focusing more on reality. Alice was silent for a while. Then she asked if the girl would accompany her into the garden, but the maid replied that she would not, since Lady Fairouz wished to see only the concubines. She also explained that the maids in the gardens that His Majesty visits become too crowded. Alice was surprised and said that she would really be only glad if she were present with her. But of course it was a lie, because the girl was glad that the maid would not be there, and all because she would thus be able to calmly go to the library. Then suddenly Agnes laughed and said that many say that during the reign of the last emperor, one of the ladies accompanying him during his walks received the favor of His Majesty. Alice then smiled smugly and asked if the empresses were trying to prevent this. The maid laughed even more, saying that anything was possible, since Madame Fairouz was known to be jealous. The ladies giggled for a while, but after that, Alice, having calmed down, told the girl not to talk like that outside, because if anyone else heard, she would lose her. She sighed heavily and said that, of course, she understood everything and could only say this in the estate because she was in a secluded corner, and also added that she didn't get along so well with the maids, so she definitely couldn't discuss such matters. When Alice heard this, she was a little surprised, but suggested that in that case they finish quickly, so that this event would also end sooner, and she returned to Agnes. The maid smiled and said that she had almost everything ready. After that, she adjusted a few strands of her hair and, looking in the mirror, told Alice that she really was an incredible beauty. But Alice, when she looked at herself in the mirror, saw only that she had a plump upper body, a terribly thin waist, and she did not understand where the beauty was located and in general. But Agnes continued to rejoice and said that the Empress would be incredibly happy when she heard about it. The lady, jumping to her feet, immediately asked, "Is this really true?" And the maid replied that of course it was, because while she was in those gardens, Agnes would write her a letter straight away. Alice felt a little uneasy, for her conscience began to trouble her when she heard the maid say such things, and all because she had said nothing about going into the garden. But she very much hoped that Agnes would not be too offended with her, for she was really a good person. Soon the girl rose from her seat and said that she understood everything, and then added to the maid that she should sit down and write a letter. Agnes simply beamed with joy and said that she would certainly write, and also wished her mistress to be careful and have a good day. Alice waved goodbye, hoping very much that nothing bad would happen if Agnes didn't find out, and soon after she did leave. When the girl found herself outside, her eyes were simply in shock because she spent almost all her time in her room or in the virtual world and was completely unaccustomed to sunlight and how bright it was. After that, looking around, she realized that His Majesty had chosen really good weather for a walk, and she was glad that she was not going to this event. As Alice walked further and further, she thought that she would have to ask Agnes to go on a picnic with her sometime, although she only went to the garden behind the outbuilding. But still, even despite this, a picnic in a separate starting point looks like a picture from a fairy tale book, so she thought that the maid would not be against it. Alice continued walking further and came to the conclusion that moving through the air was much more comfortable than on a horse, especially in the outfit she was wearing. She thought about how she wanted to get out as soon as possible. She wanted to go beyond the gates of this castle, but for now, it was impossible for her, unfortunately. And all because in order for the concubines to leave the castle walls, she needs permission from Emperor Bahamut IV, and those who are allowed to leave are not concubines. As far as Alice knew, none of the concubines had ever stepped through this gate, and that was because they simply could not pass through it, since the emperor did not give his permission. But then suddenly, the girl heard some strange rustling in the bushes. She immediately began to nervously look around and asked at the top of her voice, "Who is that there?" All this made her very wary because there was no one around. Then she assumed that, most likely, there was no one at her eye level, which meant that she needed to look from a different angle. So Alice quickly looked up and saw some guy sitting in a tree. The stranger, seeing that she had noticed him, immediately smiled and, flirting with her, said that she had found him after all. He kept smiling with all his teeth and said that she was the girl he had never seen, and she met him. But Alice was simply delighted with his appearance. She couldn't even take her eyes off him when the guy spoke. The man, still smiling, said that, as far as he understood, she was being kept in this place as a concubine. But Alice did not answer. She was trying to figure out who this man was anyway. Of course, she immediately became wary and began to carefully examine his appearance. Alice noticed a silk shirt and a robe that only the highest aristocrats wear. He also had reddish hair, regular features, and an exquisite sword that hung from his belt. Alice immediately realized that she needed to observe her manners, so she curtsied, said that she was very pleased to meet him, and also introduced herself as who she was. When the man heard and saw all this, he immediately became wary. After that, he turned to her and asked her to tell him one thing. When the guy saw her surprised face, he said that usually, when people see him, they start to change, say that they didn't know his name, and all the time call him a noble man. However, her greeting was unusual, so he asked again if it was true that they were strangers. Of course, Alice would have liked to answer that way, but at that moment, she felt that she had to find out who he was. Therefore, she said that he did not look like an imperial knight. However, he carried a sword, which few could afford within the palace walls. She also said that she believed he had permission from His Majesty himself. Certainly, although she did not know his name, he was clearly an unusual nobleman. Alice came to this conclusion only because outsiders were forbidden to have weapons on them, and he was with his sword. The unknown man had already climbed down from the tree by that time, and smiling happily, said that she was very perceptive. Of course, there was a high probability that this guy had received permission from His Majesty, and most likely, such a person could get rid of some concubine without any problems. So Alice, who spent many years in virtual reality, could learn this. But be that as it may, her instincts told her that it was better not to run into a conflict, so she simply remained silent. Soon the man got tired of all this, and he, sighing heavily, said that she had already given her name, so he should introduce himself too. After that, the guy, bowing as befits a gentleman, said that his name was Winter Cruella Bahamut. As soon as the girl heard these words, her eyes immediately widened, and the man continued to speak, saying that he was the younger brother of Emperor Ashdodante Bahamut. So they just stood there and looked at each other for a while. Alice was completely dissatisfied and thought that she had been having absolutely no luck lately. Then she realized that this was why she spoke so informally in virtual reality. However, she still didn't know. Could the Emperor's younger brother just call him by his name like that? And what should she do if everyone found out about it? The girl also decided that she should ask him for forgiveness, so she bowed and apologized. The man immediately said that this was what needed to be done, and then asked where she was going. Alice was very worried at first because the garden and the library were on different sides. She did not know what to do, say that she was going to the garden or whether it would be better to answer honestly. But she didn't even have time to say anything because Winter got ahead of her and asked if the garden wasn't on the other side. Then the girl smiled and said that she wanted to drop in somewhere before that and then go to the meeting. When the boy heard this, he was very surprised. He didn't even try to hide it on his face. But after that, he suddenly grinned and asked, "Does she really want to see His Majesty's face first?" But before she could answer, he also said that the concubines wait for this day for years. He looked at her image and wondered if she really wanted male attention so much that she ultimately decided to go somewhere else. Alice didn't answer. She just stood there and was silent, because she didn't know how to react to all this. Of course, it was known what kind of relationship he had with the emperor, and in order to avoid unnecessary conflicts, she should have studied the genealogical tree of the imperial family. So Alice understood that in this situation she could only endure and not take it out on this man. She wanted to go somewhere far away to immerse herself in the virtual world. She thought about how all the other concubines should be preparing for the upcoming party. But based on the conversation just now, they also don't know about this guy's existence. So Alice dared to suggest that he might not often show himself in public. At this point, the man was very impatient and asked why she was taking so long to answer. After this, he extended his hand towards her and asked, "Does she really think that he is so close to the emperor?" Alice, without thinking twice, immediately moved away from him so that the guy would not even dare to touch her. However, when Winter saw such a reaction, he immediately smiled and said that she was just a useless concubine. However, he was very indignant that despite this, she did not give him a chance to touch her hair. Alice looked at the guy in surprise and could not understand what was wrong with him and why he was behaving like this. Of course, he took advantage of his position to make various inconveniences, and at that moment, the girl really wanted to hit him with wind magic, and then the matter would be over with. But at that moment, Winter reached out to her again. The girl understood that, unfortunately, she could not use her power because it took some time to charge the spell. Besides, if people found out that she had magic in the real world, things would end very badly. In fact, concubines are not supposed to have magic, so as not to put the emperor at risk. So she will have to control herself to avoid the terrible fate that may happen. Winter was starting to get angry and asked if it was really that hard for her to answer his question. Alice then, surprisingly calmly, said that His Majesty had said that she did not have to attend the party, and now she asked for forgiveness and said that it was time for her to go because she still had a lot to do. Winter suddenly smiled and asked, "Does she really have any more important things to do than his brother?" And with a sly smile on his face, he suggested that perhaps she was not interested in him, since she did not even want to meet at the specially allotted time for this. Of course, Alice saw no point in answering these questions, since her feelings had nothing to do with the emperor. But the man continued to be very assertive and said that something told him that she was going to continue sitting alone. So he asked if she had already given in like a weakling. Alice was incredibly angry at that moment. Of course, she really wanted to call on the goddess of the wind to wipe that insolent smile off his terrible face. But she realized that she could cope without it. So angry, Alice grabbed him by the shirt and started yelling at him very loudly, telling him to shut up already, and also called him red-haired. The girl began to kick him in her imagination, continuing to yell at him, asking who gave him the right to mock other people. But none of this actually happened. She merely bowed to the man and said with a smile on her face that he was very perceptive. She also asked him to allow her, as a pitiful concubine, to deviate and leave, since she was indeed in a great hurry. Winter was very surprised by her behavior. He had never met such bold concubines before, so remaining in place, he asked where she was heading. Alice, who had already turned around at this point, stopped and glanced at the man, saying that she was going to the library. After this, the man was silent for some time. Then she asked if he could go now, but the guy remained silent and just looked at her. Alice felt very uneasy about this, and she didn't understand what he was expecting at all. She did not think he wished to continue, but at the same time she had not received permission to leave. She assumed that silence was consent, so, curtsying again, she went about her business. But at that moment she suddenly heard very interesting words from Winter. He asked if she wanted to know a way to escape from the castle. Alice, hearing these words, immediately stopped and looked at him with a surprised look, and the guy, continuing to smile, asked if it was true that she wanted to ride a horse in freedom. He also, coming closer to her, asked if he should suggest to her one very interesting idea on how she could make this dream come true. Alice looked at him suspiciously and thought that he was incredibly nasty, but she wondered if he could really do that. Winter looked away for a moment and thoughtfully said that she had a pretty good figure. When the girl heard these words, she even blushed. She immediately began to cover her body with her hands, but the man did not even pay attention to this. He, smiling, said that everything was simple. If she became his concubine, then she would definitely be free. When Alice heard this proposal, she was simply stunned. She could not believe that a man actually dared to offer her such a thing. The girl was furious. She could not understand why he could even say such a thing, nor could she even think that she would agree to such a thing. But seeing her surprised face, Winter repeated his thoughts and asked, "Does she really not believe that this is possible?" Then Alice said in a calm voice that, as far as she knew, such a thing was definitely impossible, so he couldn't even suggest it to her. But then suddenly he came closer to her and said that if the emperor was not going to play with an unofficial wedding, then it would be enough for them to get his permission, and that's all. After that, he leaned closer to her and whispered in her ear that this is exactly what happened with his two concubines. Alice stood there with a stony expression and couldn't believe that it was really true. But when he saw her worried face, he told her not to worry too much. The man explained that these girls were now very happy, so she would not regret this decision either. Alice knew it didn't look like he was joking, but she didn't trust him either, and she even wondered how he was going to persuade her to do this. After a while, Winter smiled and said that not everyone smiled at such luck. However, it was just to his taste, and he would not mind having it in his possession. He also said that once she approached the emperor and received his approval, she would be able to go outside the castle as much as she wanted, so she just needed to wait. Alice at this point became very angry. She turned to His Highness in a rude voice and said that the joke had gone too far, so she proposed to pretend that the conversation had never happened at all. At that moment, he began to approach her closer and asked, "Does she really think that all this is just a joke?" He leaned over to her and finally touched Alice's hair, and then said that he liked her character. However, the only thing that could stop him was death. Alice continued to look at him with a blank look and realized that he was definitely some kind of crazy person. She didn't mean, of course, that she found him repulsive. However, she didn't know who he thought he was. The emperor himself? That he could so calmly decide the fates of strangers? When the girl did not answer him, Winter said that His Majesty had come to the garden only because the ministers had forced him to, and until then he had never slept with his concubines. He also said that it was highly unlikely that this would change. Alice was outraged when he started saying this, so she said that it simply couldn't be. But the man said with a smile on his face that the only woman Bahamut the Fourth sleeps with is his wife. He is not at all attracted to the concubines he has. The girl continued to insist on her own and said that she had heard something a little different, and then asked, "Weren't Mrs. F.A. and Rose and Mrs. Heartbarrel planning to come to the garden?" At this point, Winter laughed and said that these were exactly the same concubines he had spoken of earlier. Alice was shocked. But she realized that if they were this type of concubines, then it remained a mystery to her why they were fighting so desperately for a chance to meet the emperor. The guy took his hand away from her hair and said that if others found out about this conversation, then all the blame would lie on her, so she needed to be as careful as possible with her words in the future. Alice made no reply to this, but mentally sent him very far away. Certainly not that she wanted to tell anyone about it, but of course, she did not want to attract unnecessary attention to herself, which she did not need at all. Winter, waving his hand, said that he was sure that she understood all this herself. However, he saw no sense in bringing girls from vassal states in order to make them empresses of their country.